Alright, so in the last video I showed you out on the ramp with the aircraft and starting the engine up and then taxiing over and doing a run up and then a couple of little bits of taxiing around some more, but I want to show you how that looked on the Motec ECU. So here's that where I did that run up there, but I'll come back to that in a minute. What I wanted to show you first was where the engine start was. So if I just zoom in on that section, and then I'll just zoom in again a little bit more here. You'll see that this section here where there's no data coming in, that's where the tablet was reconnecting to the ECU. And so it's when it gets connected, then all of a sudden it starts capturing data, and I've got it set so that when the ECU powers up, that the glow plugs turn on for a given amount of time based upon the temperature of the coolant. So you can see here initially the glow plug state at the bottom there was preheat and ended up being on for about 3.5 seconds altogether, and then after that happens it goes into standby, and at this point is when I was turning on the fuel pump, the boost pump there, to prime up the high pressure fuel pump on the engine. And then after that I started cranking the engine with the starter button or starter switch. So you can see the glow plugs I currently had set to crank heat, so they're actually coming on again. And what I've noticed here, if you look at the engine RPM here of 81 RPM initially there, it slowly starts to creep up there. But the amount of amp draw from the glow plugs, about 70 amps, is really slowing down the starter motor and making it take a long time to get the engine up to an RPM where it will actually fire up. And you'll see it's slowly getting up here, 300 RPM, 400 RPM. It won't fire till about 450, and then the second that the glow plugs go off, the engine fires up, and then it climbs up there and it goes up to about 1200 RPM, almost 1200, and before it finally settles down to 1000 RPM is where I got the idle set. So I'm happy with the second half. That's really a nice fast start there. Good for the engine just to kick it up there, 1200 RPM, then back to idle. But this part here where it's just cranking and it's running the glow plugs where it probably doesn't need to given the current temperatures, I'm just going to turn that off for the next start, and we'll see how that plays out. So look for that on the next video, and we'll see what a difference that makes in terms of how quickly the engine starts. And that's how I used to have it before I had the glow plugs working. So again, we'll see how it plays out. So let's look now how that run up went. So if I zoom in on that section, you can see here, this is the throttle there, the yellow one. I tried to throttle up as quickly as you would, when you're just taking off, but I don't want to just sort of slam the throttle because there's enough power in the engine where when the prop is at flat pitch that it can easily go over 4000 RPM on the engine, and the prop is designed to only run with an engine speed, or at least maximum engine speed of 3800, where the prop would be at 2400. So I don't really want to overspeed past 3800 if I can. I got the governor set to about 3500, 3550. So I brought the throttle in fairly smoothly there, and listening to the prop. And just watching here, you can see the RPM at 66% throttle here. I've got 3700 already of the engine RPM, and then that's when the governor kicks in because it's gone over 35, and you can see it starts to come back to 35, and I could hear that change, at which point then I just put the rest of the throttle in there. You can see I went from 73 all the way up to 100. And if you look at the boost levels and stuff, you see here the ambient pressure was 13.9 outside, and the airbox pressure, so that's coming into the first turbo, that was 13.9. But if you move around here, you can see that fluctuates to 13.8. So I'm actually losing 0.1 of a psi on the air intake, and I'm not worried about that because it's so minuscule compared to the sort of boost that we're creating. So that small little air filter that I have on the air intake isn't really causing any sort of problem to be worried about. And you can see as I kept the throttle there into 100%, at 100%, the maximum boost I got to here was 44.8, something like that was the maximum PSI coming out of the second turbo, and first turbo was 20.8. Alright, so looking at the intake temperatures there, back right after I brought it up to full throttle there, you can see this compressor outlet temperature here, which is the air coming out of the second turbo, was over 300 degrees, and it pretty much stabilizes just past that. It never gets really much hotter than about 310, I think. The problem is that sensor I have doesn't really go beyond 305. It just stops reporting after that. But you can see how it was leveling out there if you look in the chart there, and it's always been like that, and many times I've done it. It might get to maybe 320 or something like that. But as you can see, the temperature there coming out of after the first intercooler, it starts to climb as it gets heat soaked. It has that fan pulling air through it, through the radiator and the intercooler. But with the aircraft not moving, it doesn't. There's not enough air being pulled through there to keep it stabilized. And then the second intercooler that was running the fuel, that was turned on, so you can see that's actually providing another 50 degrees of temperature drop. So here we're getting 70 degrees from the first intercooler and 50 degrees from the second one, so we end up with 181 degrees intake temperature. That should be quite a lot better once the airplane is moving through the air at 100 miles per hour plus. So that's looking to see. But at this point, when I was running this, I was initially watching the EGTs, or what I've now relabeled the turbine inlet temperature, so the temp of air going into the first turbo. And so here you can see I didn't really want it to go anything more than 1700. I kind of want to just have it max out at 1650 for like a climb out at most. And you can see 1660 here. So that's what I was watching, and then it went to 1700, and I was like, yeah, well, here's where I'm going to sort of back off the power. So I went from 100% throttle there and back to 85%, at which point, if you look at the temperatures here, it starts to drop right away, and it's 1660, and it doesn't take very long at all, and it's back in the mid 1500s. And so looking at that, I think I can quite happily maintain, say, 90% throttle there and keep this under 1650, and that'll give us a good sort of climb out thing, with the aircraft without sort of overheating anything. So at that point, I was starting to watch the temps here on the coolant and the oil. So if we go back here to where the run started out for the coolant and oil temps, I waited till we were basically 150. You can see they're 149 and 150 for the coolant and oil temp. And this is how we'll be when we do the first flight. We'll just wait. We'll start up the engine cold, taxi up to the runway, and then wait for it to come up to temperature, and then immediately take off. So we've got the most amount of range in terms of temperature gain for the first flight, so we don't have to worry so much about anything getting too hot. So as you can see, temperature starts climbing there, and again, all we're doing is just we've got the fan on the radiator there is what's pulling cool air through there, so it doesn't do that great of a job. And the Audi engine actually has a oil cooler that's sort of tied into the coolant system of the engine, so it's running coolant through this oil cooler inside of the top V of the engine, so those temperatures pretty much stay the same. And of course the coolant is also cooling the heads of the engine, so you can kind of see when you start to see the spread there where the coolant temperature increases more than the engine oil temp, it means that's the heads is where the extra temperature is coming from, and then that obviously shows up here when you've got the EGTs running higher. So anyway, that's what I was watching next after I sort of stabilized the EGTs by pulling the throttle back to sort of high 80s. And it's not going to take long with no fresh air coming in there before it's going to peak out. So I was watching there for about 225 on both of those, and at which point that's when I wanted to throttle back. And so you can see here I've got all the way down to about here, and I actually throttled back a little bit more there because the EGTs, or the turbine inlet temperature, was going up over 1600 again. So I just throttled back a little bit more, about 80%. And then it wasn't long, and I had 225 on the temperatures there. So that's when I throttled back. But if you look at the timing, we started out at around about 9 minutes and 10 seconds is where I put the throttle in, and got to 10 minutes and 30. So we have a 1 minute and 20 seconds there, so 80 seconds total for this sort of climb out profile, and that's with no cooling air coming in whatsoever. So I think that's pretty comfortable there. If we end up getting a 1200 foot per minute rate of climb, and we've got a minute and 20 seconds, we're going to be getting around about 1600 feet in the air before we have to pull the power back, and that's based upon no cooling here. So once we have cooling, we'll find where the sweet spot is there, and just maybe the power will be back at 70%, and it'll depend on the deck angle for climb out. But Justin is expecting to take the aircraft up to 10,000 feet for the first thing, so he'll just sort of establish a climb that's comfortable for temperatures and then just sort of keep going. Okay, let's talk about the power output from that run, at least what the estimates are. So using the book number for the Audi engine, which is 0.326 pounds of fuel per horsepower per hour, it basically works out around about, if you take the fuel flow, gallons per hour, and you multiply that by about 20, you end up with the horsepower that you're putting out. So when I had it at full power there, and the maximum amount of boost, 44.8, around about there, it was 21.7. So potentially that's 400 horsepower, maybe less, maybe more, but it should be somewhere around about there. And then as I powered back to sort of 85% there, it's dropping to about 340, and that sounds reasonable. And the other thing to look at here is the lambda estimate. So when you're running over 1, over more than 1.0, you shouldn't really be blowing any black smoke, because you're running with the best fuel mixture you can. In other words, you've got as much fuel as you can put in there for the amount of air that you've got, without sort of running too rich and just blowing black smoke. And you can see initially when I'm running at the highest power settings there, it goes down to 0.93, which means that I'm blowing a little bit of black smoke, and you can actually see that if you look back in the video from that last run, you can actually see a little bit of black smoke coming out there. But then again, if you notice, when I throttle back a little bit, it's gone. And for the second half of the run there, the lambda's always over 1, so no black smoke at all. So generally, the fuel flow horsepower numbers should be pretty accurate right when you're at the best, at a 1 lambda, so right about here. So there, 20.4, that should have been about 400 horsepower even. In other words, I'm not just throwing a bunch of fuel at it and saying, oh, it's using tons of fuel and it's not generating power. Here it's running as its peak efficiency and burning 20 gallons an hour, so that should be about 400 horsepower at least, or close to. So anyway, that gives me again a comfortable feeling that we're getting the horsepower that we should be getting out of it. We've got a nice RPM running there. The lambda's good. We're not too rich. Potentially I may dial that back later on, but it may just turn out that the sweet spot is to not put more than 20 gallons an hour fuel flow in this, and I can just limit the throttle or the amount of fuel delivery per the throttle for that once we get it sort of figured out and dialed in. But anyway, most of this is all looking good now. I'm happy with the numbers on everything here. And this is what we're going to be going with for the first flight, this tune. So let me know if you have any comments on that, or if you think something I've said is completely out of whack. I'd appreciate it, but I think I'm pretty close to providing the numbers that I think are going to work for this. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you was a couple of spreadsheets this Mark has made for me quite a while back now, just so give us some information on performance, takeoff, climb, and that sort of stuff. And these are the ones I was using to determine sort of where we'd be rotating at and that sort of stuff. And so what Mark's done here is basically gone through the alpha, the angle of attack, for various different degrees from 0 to 15. Got the wing alpha in there, which is based just upon the angle of attack of the wing when it's static, and same with the foreplane there, or the canard. And then from there he's working out the CLs, the coefficient of lift of the wing and the canard, with max elevator and with no elevator. And then from there he can determine for a given speed how much lift is being generated for each particular angle of attack. And then from there we can figure out exactly what a good profile is going to be in terms of speed and angle of attack for takeoff and climb out. And we've pretty much come to an agreement there, at least Justin and I have, that we're going to shoot for 85 knots for rotation. So all these numbers here, they're all in miles per hour. So 85 knots is about 97 miles per hour. So we're going to use this one here, basically the last scale there, 97 miles an hour. And if you look at this little chart down here, he's got the different angles of attack. And if we go to the 97 mile an hour column here, this one, that's the one we're going to use. And what it basically says there, if we maintain or if we establish a 2-degree angle of attack on the aircraft, we'll be right here in the area there where the aircraft will fly. If you go 7 degrees of angle of attack, the canard will stall, and any less angle of attack in here with less speed, you don't have enough to fly. So this is basically, the X here shows the minimum angle of attack you need at that flying speed, or that airspeed, to get the aircraft off the ground. So that's what we're going to go for here. So that'll be 2 degrees angle of attack, 97 miles an hour, which is 85 knots. And if you look over here where those numbers come from, you can see that this is with the 2 degrees angle of attack there. That gives us, I think that's the 2 degrees there. Yeah, sorry, that's 1 degree. So 2 degrees angle of attack gives us 3988 pounds of lift altogether, and the aircraft is about 35 right now. So we'll be, climbing out there, not just hovering. We'll actually be climbing. 3593 would be at 1 degree angle. So when we go to 2 degrees, we're actually climbing out. And so that gives us what the profile is going to look like for takeoff. So it won't be a very steep nose up attitude. It'll just be getting the nose off, holding about 2 degrees nose up, and it should take off and begin to climb. And lastly, I want to show you Mark's calculations for rate of climb. So this is another tab here, another sheet in the spreadsheet. So this particular chart that he's got here is sea level rate of climb with the aircraft at 3,800 pounds gross weight with 1,000 pounds of static thrust. And so that's what the last time I measured it, that's what I was getting from the engine, 1,000 pounds of static thrust. The aircraft will be lighter than that. It'll be under 3,600 pounds. But we can use this and sort of extrapolate from what we think it's going to be. So we'll be climbing out around about 100 miles an hour, and that'll obviously accelerate a little bit as we get a little bit quicker with the power. But let's just choose 100 miles an hour, and I was just trying to figure out exactly where his 0 mark is here, the way he's done the scale. But let's just say it's to the left of where the marker is. So 100 miles an hour will be this line here. That means we would be just about 1,150 feet per minute climb out. So that minute and 20 seconds that we have should easily get us 1,500 feet above the ground before we have to pull the power back to anything less than sort of 90%. So that just makes me feel comfortable. We can easily get to pattern altitude in less than a minute, and with this sort of climb rate here, and it'll be better than this because we're not running so much weight. So let's just sort of guesstimate that we'll be maybe doing, say, 1,250 feet a minute, and if we're climbing a little bit quicker, if we go at 110 knots, say, then that would be here, and then we add another 100, we're starting to get closer to 1,400 feet a minute. So but it'll be interesting to see when we actually do the first flight and we capture all this information. It'd be interesting to see how the numbers compare to what Mark's calculated here. But he was pretty accurate with his calculation of what sort of airspeed it would take to get the nose off with the canard, with the foreplane. So and I know that when I took the aircraft up there to about 80 knots and had the nose up, that almost got the mains off. You could see how light that they got, and that was a while back now. But I think and that was when I was actually powering back and letting the aircraft power back. So I think 85 knots there, and continuing to power out, we should be off the ground and be climbing maybe around about 1,200 feet a minute for this first one, with that angle of attack that we're going to have there. So we'll see how we go. Anyway, that's just going to be this little video. I know it was kind of boring, but maybe some people might have found this interesting. And if you want to look back at the previous video, then just check out the end link here and go and have a look at the last video where I did the run up there out on the ramp. So yeah, thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.